welcome to the Royal Rota, your weekly podcast on all things royal from ITV, where we hope you enjoyed last week's episode, or at least found it very interesting, last week's episode on Kenya, and there'll be much more of that to come. We're going to stay with a very theme of overseas, aren't we, Lizzie? Because there's been so much going on, as you mentioned last week, with Israel, Gaza, and there was a significant speech. What did the palace call it? Like a keynote speech from the king last night in the City of London.
Yeah, hello.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Yes, a State of the Nation speech, I think it was called, that the king made at Mansion House in the City of London on Wednesday night. They were there, the king and the queen were there to attend a dinner to recognise the work of the City of London's civic institutions and livery companies.
Yes, I'm never quite sure what those things are, to be quite honest with you. And this thing about the sword, was it the pearl sword that was a present to the City of London, not from Elizabeth II, from Elizabeth I in 15 something or other. And then they've got this process where he gets given it and then he hands it back to symbolise the authority of the Lord Mayor of London in the square mile. What does any of that actually mean? I don't actually know. I did all that at the top of my head. I didn't even read it.
I know that was incredible. All I know is that it was upholding the traditions of a new monarch's first visit to the City of London in a coronation year, and then he addressed the assembled guests.
So some questions without looking at your screen. I'm going to cover it.
I've read everything that was on my screen.
Okay, right.
He's going to ask me about Plantagenets, aren't you?
Who was the first king to do this ceremony of being handed the sword and handing it back?
You told me this yesterday, didn't you?
Yep.
William III.
Correct.
Thanks.
Well done. And what can you tell us about William III? Not a lot. Okay.
On to the King's speech.
Moving on. Elizabeth I was the one who handed over this sword. So it's an old gem, this thing, isn't it? So he did all that. He went to the city, and of course his mother did a very, very similar thing in 1953 when she first went to the city. So it's been a while since they've done. I kind of that you do this job and you suddenly realise there are more and more of these bizarre, ancient, traditional ceremonies that you haven't actually come across before. We obviously haven't come across this one because I wasn't doing this job in 1953.
No, I thought we were through our year of first, but here we have found a first.
We found another one.
We found a first.
But so to the speech. So he was there in all his finery. You're probably going to tell us what Queen Camilla was wearing, because I know somebody asked that very question last night. Some jewels belonging to the late Queen, I believe.
I can tell you exactly
because there are people who are very interested in this.
Queen was wearing. She was wearing a black evening dress with silver embroidery by Bruce Oldfield and the Girls of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, diamond tiara, which belonged to the late Queen, and she was also wearing a diamond necklace and earrings, which belonged to the late Queen.
Right. That was all like a foreign language to me, but I'm glad that if you're interested in tiaras, you now have the full detail. Let's talk about the speech, because there's a big conflict going on in Gaza and Israel at the moment. You won't have failed to have noticed that. Wherever you're listening to this in the world, you will have seen some news about the awful events that are going on there at the moment. The king didn't directly reference it, did he? You're right to say he did last week when he called the what Hamas did in southern Israel as a brutal act or a barbarous act of terrorism. He didn't specifically mention Israel and Gaza here, but through talking about the values of tolerance, he did have a certain message. Have a listen to part of the King's address, or officially it was called a reply, to the Lord Mayor in Mansion House in the City of London on Wednesday night.
Next, there is the breathing space we afford one another, leaving us able to think and speak freely. This well carries the politeness and respect we owe to one another, our willingness to put others first and treat them as we would wish them to treat us, to listen to their views, and if we do not agree, to remind ourselves to engage in a way which is passionate but not pugnacious. This includes the practice of our religious faith in freedom and mutual understanding. One of my first acts as sovereign a little over a year ago was to open the doors of Buckingham Palace to the leaders of the major faiths represented across these islands, to welcome them with respect and indeed love, and to rededicate my life to protecting the space for faith itself within our shores. Such understanding, both at home and overseas, is never more vital than at times of international turmoil and heartbreaking loss of life.
I mean, when he's talking about international turmoil and heartbreaking loss of life, it's quite clear what he's referring to there. But it's kind of saying that we are a very tolerant nation. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of religion in this country. And it's that kind of tolerance that's now required and clearly lacking in areas of the Middle East at the moment.
Yeah, the speech reflected on what, as the King says, makes this nation of ours so special. And he talked about the UK as a community of communities, and he was focusing really on the deep wells of the shared values inherent in our society.
Tell us about your deep wells then, because I think there were 5 deep wells, weren't there?
5 deep wells.
The deep well of civility and tolerance, we've kind of touched on that. There's the breathing space that we afford one another so we can think freely, speak freely. He said there's another well where we care for those less fortunate than ourselves. There's the science and innovation and how that might combat and mitigate the effects of climate change. And fifthly, the well that we have as Brits, the British sense of humour is world renowned, he says.
And he also says, just as well, given some of the vicissitudes I have faced with frustratingly failing fountain pens this past year.
Now, do you want to explain vicissitude? What is a vicissitude? I can't. This is exactly the sort of word that I think I know what it means, but then I end up looking it up.
Go on. What?
In other words, googling it. It's like a change of a sudden change of circumstance. So he was referring to this is the sense of humour I had when a fountain pen exploded in my hand and I got a bit cross with it. You remember that? Just after the
coronation? Just after accession. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Anyway, I often have a vicissitude most days of my working life. So how many vicissitudes do you have each day? When your day suddenly goes downhill or uphill? I suppose it could work both ways, couldn't it?
Could work both ways.
A sudden change of circumstance. Your vicissitude could be a positive and a negative, one imagines. Anyway, this isn't a podcast on English language; it's a podcast on the royals.
So those were the 5 wells.
Deep wells.
The 5 deep wells, and but he also talked about the instinct to cooperate whenever and wherever possible, being deep within us. And I thought this was an interesting bit of the speech. He said, the temptation to turn ourselves into a shouting or recriminatory society must be resisted, or at least heavily mitigated whenever possible, especially in the digital sphere where civilized debate too often gives way to rancor and acrimony.
In other words, on social media, we're too shouty and we're too polarised and we're too negative. And kind of, hello, Twitter.
X.
Sorry, X. Hello, X/Twitter, and increasingly places like Instagram as well, but particularly X and Twitter. It's a shouty space where everyone's looking for recriminations and there's too much rancour and acrimony. I think on that I completely agree with him. He's kind of saying we should be a bit more civil in our debating, and that will help us.
Yes.
Oh yeah. The King's address to the City of London dissected. But we mentioned the very severe situation going on in the Middle East at the moment. And yes, he didn't mention it specifically there. There was that reference to heartbreaking loss of life. But according to Palace aides who I spoke to yesterday, this is the King just not trying to be political, not trying to get involved in culture wars and all the rest of it, and not obviously focusing on political things like Brexit and Scottish independence and cancel culture, but doing what the King thinks he should be doing as king, which is moving above politics, taking on that kind of paternal role, not just as an actual father and grandfather, but as the sort of father of the nation, if you like, and a plea for calm and for respect. And we're told that the King has been particularly concerned over this last week or so with inter-community tensions in the UK, and by that we presume he means that we've had those flashpoints between those protesting in against the Israeli action in Gaza, but also those protesting following the terrorist atrocities committed by Hamas in southern Israel.
Yeah, he recently held an audience with the chief rabbi. It was a private audience at Buckingham Palace, and we were told it's an opportunity for the king to express in person his care and concern for the Jewish community in the UK who are suffering from grief, fear and anguish.
And this, of course, is the same chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, who the king allowed to stay at Clarence House the night before the coronation, because the coronation was on a Saturday, Sabbath, and therefore the chief rabbi was unable to use any sort of motorised transport in order to get himself there. So this is the way in which the king thinks he's able to reach out to all sections. And as he mentioned in that speech, that he invited lots of the various religious leaders into Buckingham Palace within the first week or so of
his reign. Yeah, he said in his speech that he welcomed them with respect and indeed love, and rededicated his life to protecting the space for faith itself within our shores.
And just to recap, because we didn't do it last week, we were focused on Kenya, but the two most senior members of the royal family have actually expressed statements, quite strong statements, I thought, for them, not on TV, not public words, but through their spokespeople at the various two palaces.
Yeah, so the king's spokesperson said that the king was appalled by and condemns the barbaric acts of terrorism in Israel. It is a situation that the king is extremely concerned about and has asked to be kept actively updated, and his thoughts and prayers are with all those suffering, particularly those who have lost loved ones, but also those actively involved as we speak. There was also a
one from Prince William and Kate,
statement, from a spokesperson for the Prince and Princess of Wales. They are profoundly distressed by the devastating events that have unfolded in the past days. The horrors inflicted by Hamas's terrorist attack upon Israel are appalling. They utterly condemn them. As Israel exercises its right of self-defense, all Israelis and Palestinians will continue to be stalked by grief, fear and anger in the time to come.
I do think, however, that since that statement was made, Israel's got a right to self-defence, and people are still saying that, but obviously what is a proportionate response and what is not a proportionate response, that's where the debate has kind of moved on a week later, hasn't it? And I know we won't talk about it in this podcast, but all the claims about the hospital and who was responsible for that explosion at the hospital that killed so many innocent Palestinians, that debate has obviously moved on a little bit since both the King and William and Kate made those comments.
Yeah, and I should also add that Prince William has also written personally to the chief rabbi. Of course, William visited Israel in 2018, becoming the first member of the royal family to carry out an official visit to Israel. The King, then Prince Charles, had been before, but never on an official visit. He has since been in 2020. And
you've got to think about all their links there. Do you remember we should also note that the King has spoken to King Abdullah of Jordan. Again, it's head of state to head of state level here we're talking about. The King spoke to President Herzog of Israel as well. This isn't talking on a political level, it's talking head of state to head of state. And we know, because we've been with them, haven't we, what a close relationship our own king and queen, but also how Prince William has with the royal family in Jordan, King Abdullah, Queen Rania, who we've interviewed a number of times on our programme, and the Crown Prince of Jordan as well, who converses with Prince William. And we don't know precisely at the time of recording this Rishi Sunak's itinerary, but it was in whether or not he will meet King Abdullah of Jordan. But President Biden was unable to do so because that meeting was cancelled following the hospital attack. And I suppose it does open up a conversation about what is the role of the royal family when you are head of state and there's something so monstrous going on in a place like the Middle East.
Yeah, and I just circling back to that statement from Kate and William and that visit that Prince William had in 2018, he said that those that they met overwhelmingly shared a common hope, that of a better future, and in the midst of such terrible suffering they continue to share that hope without reservation. So they've both, Charles and William, been to the region, seen with their own eyes, had conversations and sort of gained an understanding of what people living there are hoping for.
And do you remember how very carefully choreographed and balanced it had to be? Everything they did in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, for example, they had to do something of equal value or significance across the border in the West Bank. Of course, we're not talking about Gaza. They didn't go there then because Hamas was still in control then, and that was completely out of bounds. But they did get both Prince Charles, as he was now king, and Prince William went over the border into the West Bank and met the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas.
Yeah, it was a very sensitively handled trip
Yes,
for both
wasn't
of
it?
them.
Yeah, even like going places like Bethlehem, the the birthplace of Jesus Christ, you have to cross the border and go into the West Bank in order to visit Bethlehem. This is why this. We haven't got time, and nor can we in this podcast talk about all the issues in the Middle East at the moment. But that was a particularly, I thought, significant moment for the soon to be king. We didn't know it at the time, of course, and for Prince William to go to both sides of the can't call it a border. What do we call the demarcation line between Israel and the West Bank. We've got to be very careful with language when we talk about this part of the world. Some people say occupied Palestinian territories. Other people say, well, that's not that because Israel hasn't occupied it. Lots of things you could get involved with language, but it was very important, wasn't it, for the King and Prince William to get this right and to balance it very carefully.
Yeah, and were you surprised that they released the statements that they did through their spokespeople, or were you sort of...
I kind of was, actually. I wasn't expecting them to. I thought they would just kind of step back and I suppose they can comment on a natural disaster. This, but to be fair, it was the Queen who commented very famously on the Twin Towers when they came down, and grief is the price we pay for love. She famously said then. There are moments when they do have to stand up, and whatever is going on, however politically sensitive it is in Gaza. I mean, what happened to those Israelis, more than 1,000 of them, was a brutal act of terror. And you can say that because that's exactly what it was.
And if you think about Ukraine, they've been the royal family have been very public in their support for the Ukrainian people since the war.
But they've taken a side in Ukraine, isn't it? Whereas they clearly haven't taken a side here because and that I think is the significant difference. That's where we are at the moment. It's a rapidly changing situation, very fluid. Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister of the UK, is in the region at the moment, and all things might change, and then who knows, the King might say more words, but we're just bringing you up to date on that. And actually, I suppose that is kind of, as best we can, answer the question: what's the role of a monarch in the royal family in times of a significant international crisis? Yeah,
we get asked that a lot, don't we?
Yes, right. We'll be in Kenya next when we speak to you, talking about all the things that we spoke about last week. And if you did miss it, do go and have a listen to the Royal Rota from last week when we spoke to the author Caroline Elkins. A fascinating and very interesting episode about the British role as the colonial power in Kenya in the late 1950s. And there'll be a lot to discuss in our podcast when we next speak to you from either Nairobi or Mombasa, which is where we'll be heading next with this royal family and with this podcast.
We will. That visit gets underway on the 31st of October, and we'll be there with them, travelling to Nairobi and then on to Mombasa. So we will bring you the latest from there.
Speak to you from there. Bye-bye.